words to adequately describe the unimaginable tragedy that brings us before this court today. By my comments, I'm not even going to try to express the horror, the pain, or the suffering that the defendant has caused to these families, to this community, and to all who were a part of this investigation.
This is a sentencing hearing. The only thing that has happened at this point is Chris signed a piece of paper. He made a squiggly line on a piece of paper. The purpose of this hearing is to determine how Chris is going to be punished.
However, I do want to spend a few minutes sharing with the court the details of the crime, as so far you've only had an opportunity to review the affidavit and a few facts here and there that have been offered to the court in the motions and pleadings that have been filed.
So the judge in this case has not heard really any information about the case at all. All he knows is that Chris pleaded guilty. He signed a plea deal, or a plea bargain as they sometimes call it, which is often just a strategic move. People sign these sometimes under duress, and they don't always admit when they do sign them under duress. Oftentimes these are strategic moves that people do in order to get a better outcome. Chris has not verbally affirmed any of these charges, except for the hearing before this, where he said, no, I wasn't forced to do this. Yes, that is what I signed. He's not given any verbal confession or written confession whatsoever, apart from the first confession that he gave multiple times over and over and over again without a single inconsistency. The story where he walked in, Shanann was murdering his daughters, and he killed her instantaneously, basically. He gave that story multiple times. The investigators only questioned him on that story for 5 minutes. They only challenged him on it for 5 minutes, and he, over the course of about 2 hours, he gave that story over and over and over again. He never got a single detail wrong. But because he signed this piece of paper, because he made this squiggly line, they are going to only look at what the prosecution has to say. The prosecution is going to be the only one giving the judge any information about the case. And this man right here, DA Michael Rourke, is free to manipulate the facts however he wants, because Chris has told his lawyers to stand down.
The questions that have screamed out to anyone who will listen since August 13th of 2018 are why and how. Why did this have to happen? How could a seemingly normal husband and father annihilate his entire family? For what? See, these are the questions that only one individual in this courtroom or on this planet knows the answers to.
So what he just told you right there is he doesn't have a motive. He doesn't know what the motive was. He doesn't understand why this happened. And yet he wants the judge to go forward with a sentencing hearing, and he wants to do that because there is malice in the fact that we don't understand why this happened. Because we don't understand it, that means that Chris is so evil that we're too moral in order to understand why he did it. The fact that we don't have a clear motive doesn't mean maybe we should relook at the facts. It means Chris is evil.
I fully expect we will not receive the answers to these questions today, nor will we at any point in the future. I don't expect that he will ever tell the truth about what truly happened or why. Even if he did, there is no rational way.
So we don't have the facts here. We don't know what really happened, and we're probably never going to know what really happened. But we're going to sentence Chris Watts anyway. Even though we don't know why he did it. We don't know how he did it. We have a general idea of how he did it, but we don't know for sure. We don't know why or how, or even what exactly he did. We don't even know where it happened. We don't know when exactly it happened. We don't have a murder weapon. All we have is the 3 people went in the house, and they left in his truck, and they ended up where they ended up. And we have a confession saying that, a verbal, repeated, consistent confession saying that Shanann committed maternal filicide, and then he instantaneously retaliated, and he tried to hide the bodies. That is the only confession we have. But because he signed his name on a squiggly line, we're going to assume that the prosecution is the best person to be the fact finder in this case. And the prosecution is saying, I don't fucking know. I don't know what happened. I don't know what his motive was, but we're going to go forward with the sentencing hearing anyway.
That any human being could find those answers acceptable responses to such horrific questions. The best we can do is try to piece together some kind of understanding from the evidence that is available to us.
Some kind of understanding is all we need to move forward with the sentencing hearing. Just some kind of understanding. We don't need to know where it happened, how it happened, why it happened. We just need to fuel hatred for Chris Watts.
And the evidence tells us this. The defendant coldly and deliberately ended 4 lives.
So here's the problem with this. The law is written very well. It's very specific about exactly how charges are supposed to be filed, how they are supposed, when they're supposed to be filed for different things. There's a lot of very specific language about exactly what felonies, what class felony you should use, and there's a lot of specific stuff that you need to figure out before you go filing charges, and especially before a judge goes and sentences someone for a charge. The language that he's using here, coldly and callously or something like that, that's not in the law. And I don't know how he determined that those adjectives were consistent with what factually occurred. But that doesn't matter.
Not in a fit of rage, not by way of accident, but in a calculated and sickening manner. Shanann was 34 years old. She had married the defendant in November of 2012. Over the weekend leading up to August 13th, she had been at a work conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and returned home in the early morning hours of August 13th. We know that she got home about 1:45 in the morning. The doorbell camera on their home shows her arriving back home from the airport. Shortly thereafter, at least according to the defendant, they had what he referred to as an emotional conversation about the state of their marriage.
So that's the only time that he bears witness to what Chris actually confessed to. And that emotional conversation, he was consistent about the emotional conversation before he gave his full confession. So that's probably why that was included here.
And about what their lives would look like going forward. What was said during that emotional conversation, only he knows. What we do know is that shortly after that, the defendant strangled her to death with his own hands. We know that he slowly took her life the morning of August 13th. We know that this was not done in an uncontrolled, vengeful manner that he tried to describe to agents from CBI and the FBI. If that were the case, you would expect to see vicious, horrible bruising about her neck, shoulders, and face. You would expect to see the hyoid bone in her neck broken. You would expect to see some kind of defensive wounds on his body as she struggled and fought for her own life.
Yeah. So the hyoid bone is actually only broken in about 1/3, 1 out of 3 cases. It's only broken in 1/3 of strangulation cases, so I'm not really sure where he got that information from. And he also says that if Chris strangled her in a vengeful manner, you would expect to see vicious bruising. So aren't all strangulations, don't they all have something to do with passion of some kind? Wouldn't you expect all strangulation offenders to have some kind of passion? I guess that, not really sure what he's getting at there. And then another thing he said right there is that you would expect to see defensive wounds on Chris from when Shanann fought back. But the confession that he's targeting right there, in that confession, Chris said that Shanann was basically suicidal almost, that she had just murdered her own children, that she was in an extremely emotionally compromised state. So the idea that she must have fought back for her life is unfounded. Because in that emotional state that he described, that Chris described, you wouldn't necessarily expect someone to fight back. This person is, a lot of people who commit maternal filicide also commit suicide. So the idea that he's proposing here is unfounded.
None of those present. The only injuries that were on Shanann's body were one set of finger or bruising, what appeared to be fingernail or finger mark bruising to the right side of her neck. We know that our experts will tell us that it takes 2 to 4 minutes to strangle someone to death manually with their own hands.
Let's rewind that. Did you catch that?
Or bruising, what appeared to be fingernail or finger
Listen
mark
to what exactly he says
to the
here.
right side of her neck. We know that our experts will tell us that it takes 2 to 4 minutes.
He says, we know that our experts will tell us that it takes 2 to 4 minutes. Notice what he did not say. He did not say, our experts told us that it takes 2 to 4 minutes. So I did some Googling, I did some research on whether or not that number is actually true, and I found out that that's actually not true. That's unfounded. It might be true, but it's unfounded. There's no good reason to state that in a formal sentencing hearing. And I suspect that the reason he said his experts would tell us is because they didn't actually tell him that. He's making that up. Or else he would have said our experts told us, not will tell us.
To strangle someone to death manually.
And in actuality, what I found in my research was that nobody really knows. It could take as quick as 1 minute, or it could be 4 minutes, or it could be 2 minutes. The reason nobody really knows is because you can't perform this in a lab. You can't really get accurate statistics because this always happens behind closed doors, and you can't go into a lab and strangle someone just to find out how long it takes for research purposes. So we don't really know. That number is just being used for theatrical effect.
With her own hands. The horror that she felt as the man that she loved wrapped his hands around her throat and choked the life out of her must have been unimaginable.
What does that have to do with the law, Mr. Rourke?
Even worse, what must Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, must have experienced or thought as their father, the one man on this planet who was supposed to nurture and protect them, was snuffing out their lives. They both died from smothering. Let me say that again. The man seated to my right smothered his daughters.
Statistics show that men who kill their children typically do so with brute force, with blunt force, with a blunt object, with some kind of weapon, with a firearm. And women tend to kill their children by smothering or by drowning or less physically assertive means.
Why? Imagine the horror in Bella's mind as her father took her last breaths away. Your Honor, understand very clearly, Bella fought back for her life. The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life.
So what he's saying, what he's alleging, is that the reason this little piece of Bella's lip, the frenulum, was ripped was because she fought back for her life. So he's saying that she was smothered with a pillow. He didn't say with a pillow, but that's the assumption. A pillow was in front of her face, right? And she somehow ripped her lip while struggling for her life while Chris was smothering her. So I'll try to reproduce that myself right now. There's no pain to that part of my lip at all. I can move it around any which way you can possibly want. The only way that would ever happen is if you had a movement like this. That's the only movement that's actually putting pressure on that frenulum. So, right there, that really only keeps your lip from going up. So the lip would have had to go up dramatically in order for the frenulum to get torn. I don't have a photo of it. I haven't seen it. But from the description on the autopsy, it certainly seems like the only way that could have possibly happened is with that movement right there, because that does try it yourself. Pushing your lip up like that makes that part of your body feel pain. So what that's consistent with is not a death struggle, but with being forced into an 8-inch hole. That's what that's consistent with.
As her father smothered her.
So again, what I'm saying is that actually most likely happened when she was being shoved into the oil tank, not when she was alive.
Had no such injuries.
You just said Celeste had no such injuries. That's probably because she was smaller. She actually fit into the hole.
In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless. The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house and back out to the truck 3 different times. 1 time for each of their bodies.
So an issue with this is I've never been able to see indication that a body with the weight of Shanann's ever entered that vehicle. We have good reason to believe it did, but it's suspicious that the suspension on the truck never heaved from the weight of her body. That could be because the suspension on the truck was lifted or it was weak or too strong. I don't know what the suspension on that truck was, so I can't say with any certainty that she couldn't have been put there. But as it has been noted by other channels, it takes a lot of force to move a physical body, into a truck. Even just around on the ground is pretty difficult when the person is completely unresponsive. But to lift a body into the truck, either into the bed or into the cab, would be very difficult for a full-grown adult. And it can be largely assumed that she was not in the cab because we don't have footage of Chris coming around to the other side of the truck in the cab to pull her the rest of the way through. So she was most likely in the bed and probably wrapped with a sheet.
He then drove them away from their family home 1 final time, intent on hiding any evidence of the crimes that he had just committed.
And the reason I say that is because it's questionable. How can you move forward with this type of sentencing hearing if you don't have a clear visual on the crime, on the bodies being transported?
In one final sign of callousness for his wife, his daughters, and their unborn son, and their remains, he drove them to a location that he thought no one would ever find them.
So here's an interesting thing. The truck was parked at the oil field in a place where none of the oil workers ever park. It's just basically an open field with a couple oil tanks and a few other stuff going on. The parking is not very clear. It's not like when you drive up to the store where you can see, oh, I'm obviously supposed to park there, or, oh, I'm obviously supposed to park there. You either know where you're supposed to park because you've seen other people park there, or you don't. I certainly don't know for certain, but I suspect that that is because Chris did not drive the truck there. I think that Nicole Kessinger might have driven the truck there. And I think that because if Chris's first confession story is correct, who do you call when something like that happens? Do you call nobody, or do you call the last person you talked to who you just spent 2 hours on the phone with earlier that night? Say, I need help, please help me, I don't know what to do. So he might have called her, and that might be why we saw what at least appeared to be a female figure walking back and forth on the doorbell cam, or not on the doorbell cam, but on Nate's footage. I don't know if that actually happened, but that would be consistent with that. So I think that Nicole Kessinger might have driven the truck there because Chris was not in the emotional state to be able to drive that truck with those bodies in it. Understandably so.
Of the oil tank batteries with which he was so familiar. He knew this was safe. He had texted a coworker the night before saying, "I'll head out to that site. I'll take care of it."
So that little bit of thing that he said there, let's keep going.
He had carefully ensured that he would be alone in the middle of the plains to secrete away the remains of his family in a place that he hoped they would never be found.
So the DA here is alleging that Chris planned this out before that night, because he's sent the text message to his coworkers saying that, "Oh, I'll go out to that site tomorrow morning. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it." That means that he intentionally planned this out. He made sure that he was going to be able to dispose of the bodies without anyone knowing, and he planned it out. That's what he's saying. But later in the press conference following this, he says, or I think it was following this, it might have been following another hearing, but he says to a reporter that type of message coming from Chris at that time wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary. Because we have all of his text messages, we can track all of his behavior, and when we do that, we find out that it's not out of the ordinary at all for him to do that. There is no good reason to assume that because he wanted to be out at that oil site in the morning, there's no good reason to assume that that means he was planning this out, because it's not necessarily out of the ordinary. I'll try to find that video and overlay it on this.
Did he appear to text his coworker that he could take the morning shift before or after he murdered his family?
There were text messages on Sunday afternoon, a text message, I should say, between he and a coworker talking about the work schedule. The investigation that law enforcement conducted indicated that wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary, but in conjunction with everything else we know, became an important fact for us in his efforts to have time to dispose of the bodies in the manner in which he did.
In one final measure of disrespect for the family he once had, he ensured that they would not be together, even in death, or so he thought. He disposed of them in different locations. He buried Shanann and Nico in a shallow grave away from the oil tanks. Bella and Celeste were thrown away in the oil tanks at this facility. Different tanks, so these little girls wouldn't be together in death.
So that those girls wouldn't be together in death, he says. So I looked at where exactly the tanks were and which. I found out, okay, Bella was put in this tank, Cece was put in that tank, okay? I found that out, and I've looked at where the staircase is. So you have the staircase here, right? And then you have tank 1, tank 2. Cece was put in the closest tank, Bella was put in the furthest tank. So what I think happened, based on the evidence available, is he went to the first tank, put Cece in because she was smaller, because it is an 8-inch hole. It's about that wide around. So he put her in. It was difficult to put her in there. Either he or NK did. I don't know who. It's most likely Chris, but we don't really know for sure. They put Cece in the first hole. It was difficult. So they said, let's try the other tank. Maybe the other tank has a wider opening. So they take Bella into the other tank in hopes that it has a wider opening than the first one. The tanks look identical from the outside, but when you're in a panic like that, you don't know. You're just looking for an easier way, you know? So I think that's what happened. It might not be what happened, but it's an alternative explanation that has no malice. So, but of course, he's going to jump to the malicious assumption. The assumption that involves malice, I should say. Because, like I said, this is all for theatrics. This is all for fueling hatred for Chris Watts.
Imagine this, Your Honor. This defendant took those little girls and put them through a hatch at the top of an oil tank, 8 inches in diameter. Bella had scratches on her left buttocks from being shoved through this hole. A tuft of blonde.
So we attribute that to being forced through the opening, but we don't attribute that to being forced through the opening. Very interesting.
Hair was found on the edge of one of these hatches. The defendant told investigators that Bella's tank seemed emptier than Cece's because of the sound that the splashes made. These were his daughters.
Okay, this is my favorite part. This is how we know that he's basically lying to you. What he just said there, he characterized Chris saying he could sort of tell by the sound of the splashes as Chris focusing on the sounds of the splashes, not on the fact that his daughters were in the tanks. What actually happened is he was questioned on the sound of the splashes repeatedly. The first few times he was asked about that, they wanted to know, well, how full were the tanks? We need to know this. How much liquid is in there so we know how long it's going to take to get the bodies out so we can look at them. They asked that for that reason. He was like, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to that. That's what Chris fucking said.
How far down are they? Wherever the food level was in the tank, I'm not sure. Okay. What was it when you were there? I don't know. I didn't. Okay. I wasn't looking for that. Okay.
Did you hear him drop? Like, did it seem like he dropped a ways?
One seemed emptier than the other.
Which one do you think?
The left one.
The one that Bella's in?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did it sound like she would have hit the bottom kind of thing, or did you hear her hit liquid? There's no chance that you put them in there when they're still alive, is there?
No, God, no. God, no.
Okay.
He sort of broke down and eventually said, I think one of the splashes might have been bigger. One of the splashes might have been smaller. That's what fucking happened. But let's listen to what Rourke fucking says.
A tuft of blonde hair was found on the edge of one of these hatches.
This is on
Told
film.
Investigators that Bella's tank seemed emptier than Cece's because of the sound that the splashes made. These were his daughters.
Blatant mischaracterization of what actually happened. I'll try to find the footage and overlay it onto this, but that is a blatant, intentional mischaracterization of what actually occurred. That is on film. That is publicly available. This is blatant mischaracterization.
Significantly, when his co-workers arrived at the tank battery later that morning, to a person, they all described him as acting completely normal. It was a normal workday.
Yeah, that's very normal when people are processing trauma. It's very normal for people to act like nothing happened at all. It's a coping mechanism. The brain can't process the trauma, so it's on autopilot. So people oftentimes look perfectly normal, like nothing happened at all. But in reality, their brain just hasn't processed the traumatic event yet. It's perfectly normal psychologically. It doesn't mean anything.
Even while his daughter sank in the oil and water not far away from him. And then his efforts at deception truly began. We've all seen the emotionless interviews that the
When did his efforts at deception begin? If they only truly began there.
defendant gives to the local media, asking for help in locating his family.
What else was he supposed to do?
We watched as he claimed that the house was empty without them, and that he hoped that they were somewhere safe, and that he just wanted them to come home. He told investigators that they were at home sleeping when he left for work that morning, and that Shanann had told him that she was taking the girls to a friend's house for the day.
Yeah, the actual context of that was he actually feared that Shanann was going to take the girls away from him. And he actually took actions and they were consistent with that belief that Shanann was going to physically take the girls forcibly from Chris from that home. That's probably where that came from, because of Shanann's emotional state.
What is striking about this case, Your Honor, beyond the horrors that I've already described to you, is the number of collateral victims that he created by his actions.
Okay.
While he stood in front of TV cameras asking for, were called upon to pull Bella and say, why did this have to happen, son? While Shanann texted the defendant over and over again in the days and weeks leading up to her death, attempting to save her marriage, the defendant secreted pictures of his girlfriend into his phone and searched and texted, texted her at all hours of the night. While Shanann sent the defendant self-help and relationship counseling books, one of which, ironically enough, was thrown in the garbage.
Yeah, when you're in a situation where one partner is leaving the other partner, emotionally detached, sending the partner a self-help book is not a great plan. It's what's called a push behavior. It's not a good plan. Now, granted, Chris should not have been cheating on Shanann, and he shouldn't have been emotionally detaching the way he did. But, you know, I wouldn't, if I were him, I would not try to derive maliciousness from that. It's what happens. It's just how humans work. When you're emotionally detached from your wife because you're having an affair, and then she sends you these self-help books, they're probably going to end up in a corner somewhere. You're not going to read them, or they're probably going to end up in the trash. That's just what happens. It wasn't malicious. It was just, you know, it's crappy human behavior, but it's very normal human behavior.
He was searching the internet for secluded vacation spots to take his new love in researching jewelry.
So he says, while this was happening, Chris was researching secluded vacation spots, comma, and researching jewelry, I think is what he meant to say. I think this is scripted. I think that was one idea, comma, another idea. I think, I'm not really sure. But basically what he's saying is he was researching secluded vacation spots to take his new love, to take Nicole Kessinger. That's blatantly false. So that's lie number 2. Aspen is what he was researching. The discovery tells us this. And there were text messages between Chris and Shanann about Aspen, about this secluded vacation spot. So we know that in actuality, Chris was researching secluded vacation spots to take Shanann, not his love, Shanann, not his mistress. So that's blatant lie number 2.
While Shanann took the girls to visit.
And the context of that was Shanann, after the Arizona trip, the following weekend, wanted to take Chris there so that they could fix their relationship. That was the purpose of Aspen. That was the purpose of researching secluded vacation spots. It was not Chris trying to take Nicole Kessinger there. That's just blatantly false.
The family in North Carolina, the defendant went to car museums and the sand dunes with his new girlfriend.
Yeah, Chris was left alone for 6 weeks, and reportedly that had never happened before. He had never been left alone for 6 weeks. I don't think much longer than a week before this happened, which, you know, if you're just looking at it from a non-moral standpoint, that's largely contributed to this happening. Chris was left alone when Chris has never been left alone that long before. And as we'll talk about later on, he does have some tendencies consistent with dependent personality disorder. And one of the symptoms of dependent personality disorder that's required for a DSM diagnosis is when your primary attachment figure leaves suddenly and for an extended period of time, the person with that personality disorder will immediately try to find someone else to fill that role in their lives. Don't know if that's what actually happened, but, you know, it's consistent with what we know about Chris's psychology. And, you know, that's important to note that, you know, he was left alone for 6 months. He doesn't tell you that, of course, because it's not consistent with his narrative.
The stark contrast between the subjects of their internet and text content is absolutely stunning. Even the morning after he killed them and disposed of their bodies, he made several phone calls. It also calls for the count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy as to Nico to run consecutively to counts 1, 2, and 3.
So that charge, I really like that charge because it's fun to talk about. So that charge, the class felony that they used the maximum possible charge. So, you know, with each type of charge you can charge someone with in criminal law, it can be a felony, it can be a non-felony, and there are different classes of felonies. So you could class 1 felony, class 2 felony, class 3 felony. Class 3, I think, is the worst. Each of those comes with a different set of possible sentences, of punishments, with respect to the severity of the crime. The charge that they used for Chris was intended for cases where someone rips open a pregnant woman, rips out the fetus, and the woman dies as a result. You have to have intent to terminate. You have to have intent to terminate pregnancy, one, and you have to have the physical manifestation. You have to have actus rea, as they call it, mens rea, the intent, and actus rea, the action that you actually took. So we have no way of knowing that Chris intended to terminate pregnancy, and he did not physically remove the fetus from Shanann's body. There was what appeared to be coffin birth, but we don't really know if that was natural or forced. It appeared to be natural, and that was medical examiner's conclusion, if I remember correctly. But we have no reason to think that Chris intended to terminate pregnancy specifically, and there does need to be that specific intent for that specific charge. And he certainly didn't, and Shanann certainly did not die as a result of the unlawful termination of pregnancy. This sentence resulted in a 40-year charge. And you say, oh, well, he already had 3 consecutive life sentences. What does it matter? It does fucking matter. Because this is the law. You can't just give someone a 40-year sentence on top of all this other stuff because the details matter. You can't, it matters. This charge is intended for something completely different than what it was used for. In actuality, he should not have been charged for anything at all because there is no intent. This type of charge requires intent, at least at that degree felony. I don't know, I don't remember specifically about the lower degrees, but with this degree, you absolutely must prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant specifically intended to terminate pregnancy. And furthermore, in the law, the idea of termination of pregnancy is defined as not the killing of the unborn, but the physical removal of the unborn from the womb. Technically, a doctor performing an unwanted birth can be unlawful termination of pregnancy because pregnancy is defined as a fetus being present inside of a woman's womb. So this charge applies to unwanted birth, I guess. So yeah, because you killed the woman doesn't mean that you can be charged with unlawful termination of pregnancy. That's not the way the law is written. It's just not written that way. You can't use it that way. It's extremely irresponsible.
I would suggest that the extreme aggravation present in the defendant's conduct.
And you might say, if you're well researched on this topic, that, transferred intent theory makes it so that this can be used. So when you shoot someone, or when you try to shoot someone, say there's person A, right? Person A right here is right here. Person B is right there. You're right here, right? If you're firing a gun at this person and you miss, and you hit someone else, transferred intent theory says that your intent, your malicious intent, is stored inside the bullet. Whatever that bullet hits has the intent behind it. Because in criminal law, you have to prove that you had the intent, you had malicious intent to commit the crime. So if you miss and hit someone else, if you didn't specifically intend to kill that person, you might say, oh, well, you can't be charged with that crime. Well, yes, you can, because transferred intent theory says that the intent is transferred with the bullet. Here's why that doesn't work in this case. Here's why you can't say, well, he didn't intend to kill the unborn child, but he did anyway, kind of accidentally. The intent has to be transferred through a physical mechanism. The physical mechanism carrying the intent has to make some kind of contact with the other person being impacted. So Chris's hands were used to strangle Shanann. His hands would have had to have touched the fetus for transferred intent theory to work, right? Because his hands are the malicious actors. His hands are not touching the fetus. So transferred intent theory does not work, which completely deprives this charge of all grounds.
And it is that the efforts that I have described mandate that the sentences for counts 7, 8, 9, the tampering with the deceased human body, each be the maximum of 12 years, and that those sentences run consecutively to one another.
It's like if you bomb a grocery store. I'm using this as an example because that's the example that was given to me. If you bomb a grocery store, it creates a bunch of smoke, and then someone standing outside inhales the smoke, and 3 years later gets cancer from that smoke, you are not criminally liable for that because your bomb didn't physically touch that person. Otherwise, we could be held criminally liable for a lot of things that wouldn't be fair. I think that's a correct understanding of it. Please correct me if I'm wrong, though.
It is very clear that each of these acts, that these were not the subject of one act, but each oil tank that he walked up with his daughter's bodies and the hole that he dug for his wife and unborn son mandate a mandatory consecutive sentence.
Okay, so here's my problem with this. Right now, he's talking about the tampering with the deceased human body charges. He wants, okay, so when you charge someone, when someone is sentenced in criminal law and common law, you can give them sentences that are co-occurring with each other. So say you get a 4-year sentence for each tampering charge. I think that's the right number there. You can either get 3 separate 4-year sentences, each one for each body, and they can all run what's the word I'm looking for? They can all run concurrently, I think is the word, all on top of each other, so you only end up serving 4 years because the 4 separate crimes were local enough, they were connected enough to make it so that it wouldn't be fair to give you 12 years if it was basically the same act, right? He wants them to be consecutive, so you would do 4 years, then you would do another 4 years, then you would do another 4 years for a total of 12. That's what he's asking for. So the tampering with the deceased human body charge was also applied to Shanann, along with Bella and Celeste. He wants the maximum sentence because he is saying that specifically the way he treated the bodies of Bella and Celeste were incessantly malevolent, right? That is like the worst thing you can possibly do with a human body. Threw them away like garbage, right? That's what he said, even though he passed multiple dumpsters on the way to work that morning. So he didn't actually throw them away like garbage. He put them in a steel tomb, basically. And don't think that when he put them in the oil tanks, they came out looking like those pelicans that you see with all their oil on them. That's not what happened, because they were probably actually in water for most of the time, because, you know, oil and water don't mix very well, right? You learned that in basically elementary school, right? I don't know what exactly was in those tanks, but I think the fundamental principle of oil and water not mixing is mostly correct in most cases. So they probably weren't covered in oil until the end, when all the stuff was drained out, or where it was pumped out. That was probably when they got covered in the oil, because all the water left, because oil is water sinks. I think that's probably what happened. And they didn't come out looking like those pelicans that you see in the nature videos, because the only reason the pelicans look that way, with all the matted fur, with looking horrible with all this goo and gunk all over them, is because of their feathers. Humans don't have feathers. They don't have the coating on their feathers that makes the oil gunk up like that. They came out probably looking like if you stuck your hand in a thing of oil and took it out. It's just slippery. So it's just slippery, maybe black, maybe sort of golden, creamy colored, honey colored. So don't have that image of your mind of those pelicans with all the horrible, vicious oil on them. That's not what happened.
Now the big problem comes with wildlife, particularly birds. The reason that birds can sit on the water and don't sink is because they have oil on their feathers, natural oils that repel the water. When a duckling is first hatched from the egg, if you put it in the water, it sinks. It takes several days for the oil to go on the feathers so they can swim. So therefore, when birds' feathers come into contact with crude oil, there's a problem. The way that you can clean up the birds and remove the oil is by using so-called surfactant. This is essentially like soap. What it does is to allow the oil to form tiny, tiny droplets which are essentially do no harm.
But yeah, the issue here is he wants the maximum possible sentence for the way he treated Shanann's body. What did Chris do with Shanann's body? He buried her in a grave. Let me say that again. He buried Shanann's body in a grave, in a dirt grave, in a field. Is that malicious? Could he have dumped her in a dumpster? Could he have cut her up with a chainsaw? Could he have used a knife to, cut up her entire body, put it in trash bags, throw it out in a landfill? Yeah, he could have done that. A lot of people who commit these type of crimes do that. Actually, it's extremely rare for a familicide perpetrator. It's basically unheard of for a perpetrator of familicide to treat the bodies the way he treated them. When you put a body in an oil tank, that's not normal, because these are malicious killers, right? They're practical and malicious killers. They're not thinking, oh my god, I gotta hide these immediately right now so that nobody ever finds them. They're thinking, oh, it's fine what I just did. I'm just gonna hide them in the back of my truck for a little while, or I'm gonna cut them up, I'm gonna throw them in a dumpster. That's what these people normally do, but what Chris did is he actually buried her. That's what people do when they care about people, right? Is that malicious? Is that malevolent to bury someone? No. He buried her, okay? Why do you need the maximum sentence for that? Isn't that what we always do? We bury people? Where's the malice there? He didn't throw her away like garbage. He buried her. When's the last time you heard of an evil psychopath burying their victims in an actual grave? Sometimes they'll throw them out in the woods and put leaves over them, yeah. Sometimes they'll cut them up, they'll put them in the trash, they'll throw them in a river, but they don't bury them. That's unheard of. I've never heard of that before.
It's been alluded to this morning.
Yeah, sometimes they bury them on their property. Like when they're a landowner, when they have a field out back, sometimes they'll bury them in their field out behind their house. But this is just an oil site at work, miles and miles and miles away from Chris's house. So that's not consistent with what we're alleging Chris is.
But the defendant was certainly eligible for the death penalty in this case, under the existing law in the state of Colorado. As you heard, Shanann's family strongly opposed my office seat.
So the death penalty was never on the table, realistically, because of historical precedent. Nobody has been executed in Colorado in basically forever. I think the last case was either the 90s or the 80s. The last time someone was actually executed. This happened in 2018, so it had been 18 years, despite the fact that there were many people on death row. It just doesn't happen anymore because of, I don't know why, but it doesn't happen anymore. And furthermore, the Rourke family, Shanann's family, did not want to pursue the death penalty, as is stated here, and as is recorded in other records. So, yeah, that's important.
Seeking the death penalty and being bound to the criminal justice system for the next several decades.
It's important because a lot of people think that Chris did what he did to avoid the death penalty. And you would think that his lawyers would have known, oh no, you're not going to get the death penalty because of historical precedent and because of the Rourke family's wishes. But, yeah, it makes you think, did they feed him lies? I don't know.
That's in large part, as you've heard, why we have reached the agreement that we have. 4 lives were lost at the hands of the defendant on August 13th for reasons that we will never fully understand, nor will we know. In the end, the Rourke family was much more merciful towards him than he was towards his wife, his daughters, and his unborn son. Prison for the remainder of his life is exactly where he belongs for murdering his entire family. Thank you.
So this is important because shortly after this speech that the DA gave, the judge listened to some other people talk, and then he carried out, or he gave this sentence to Chris. Said, you're going to be spending the rest of your life in prison. And I might do a video on this later on, but what the judge said was any sentence less than the maximum possible sentence would, what did he say? Would depreciate the value, the severity of the crime. And that was largely impacted, I think, by what the DA said here. And what the DA said here was extremely misleading in many places. So that's important because there's no other side of the story here. Chris didn't want his lawyers to say really anything at all. The only facts and evidence and characterization of the facts and evidence that the judge heard was what this man just said. No other discussion happened about the facts of the case. And in law, the facts of the case matter. The characterization of the evidence matters. Factual reality matters. But it didn't matter in this case. The only thing that mattered in this room in that moment was feeling hatred for Chris Watts. And facts were manipulated. The truth was not in charge there. Charges were manipulated. Charges were used as weapons of vengeance, not as tools for justice. That is why this matters. Because this is a courtroom. This courtroom should have been utilized as a tool for justice, not as a tool for not as a weapon for vengeance. And that is how that courtroom was utilized. And that matters.